Everyone thinks they know what a narcissist looks like. The loud one, the arrogant one, the manipulator. But what if I told you some narcissists are quiet, self-pitying, even kind on the surface? And what if I told you, in the right balance, narcissism is actually healthy? Let's talk about the full spectrum: overt, covert, dismissive, and where confidence turns into control. My name is Michael Perry, and I'm joined today by Justin Gates, and this is the new Ashla Podcast. Hello and welcome to the new Ashla Podcast. Today we're diving into a sensitive topic that is tossed around a lot nowadays of narcissism.
Sensitive? That's the word you're going with?
I'm going with that word because, man, I tell you what, it's always people stuck in their feelers, and I've been guilty of it, trying to understand, is someone a narcissist? Because it's a lot easier to slap a label on somebody and put them in a corner than it is to just see people for as how they are, who they are.
Yeah, we're definitely going to hurt some feelings today. I have a feeling. We're not trying to, but
yeah, I mean,
the ethos of truth will shine brightly today.
That's a nice, gentle way to phrase it.
Well, this is the word we love to hate, isn't it?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's that one condemning name we can assign someone and instantly demonize them.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think it's 5%, 3%. Narcissists consist of such a small percentage of the population. And don't get me wrong, they wreak havoc. And this is not to dismiss when you're in abusive relationships, when you're in manipulative relationships.
Toxic places.
Yeah, which is really the key theme of this is we're not trying to justify people's behavior, even talking about the spectrum of narcissism. It's not a matter of trying to make people into good guys or convince people to stay in bad relationships, but just to help gain perspective.
Yeah, the word narcissist has become one of the most common labels that we hear and see today in manners of relationships, right? And all you have to do is scroll through your phone, right? Social media, watch the news, listen to conversations in coffee shops, and you'll hear it tossed around like confetti. Narcissist, 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 right? But here's the problem. The word has become a weapon, just like many other words that we talk about. Become a weapon, and people use it to cut other people down. And most likely they're mislabeling somebody. So, and I know we're gonna work hard to try and dispel that today.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest reasons I want to bring this up is because we use it as a justification to justify our own toxic behaviors. It is a great way to generalize someone in our lives so we don't have to own up to our part of what's going on in this dynamic. Yeah. And don't get me wrong, often this person is acting horribly and we need to remove ourselves from the situation, but that's just it. We need to remove ourselves from that situation. Right. We're playing games too. I mean, one of my favorite quotes of all time is, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right?
Yeah, the law of comeback.
Yeah.
And of course, spiritually speaking, everything's a mirror, and psychologically speaking too, everything's a mirror for us.
Well, and it's like, if we look at what narcissism really is, I mean, it is a scale, and there is a healthy amount of narcissism we can have in our lives. Narcissism is part of the ego where we want to self-preserve. We want to advocate for ourselves, even if it feels unfair to others. Now, don't get me wrong, there are lines to be drawn there, so don't use my words against me, but there are times we need to put our needs first. And it's healthy narcissism that allows us to do that.
Well, for you and me, our teachings demand that we make sure that we are squared away and make sure that we are able to serve. We cannot do that if we have a broken wheel in our wagon, right? Yep. Can't get very far. So, and I know we're going to get into this today, but a lot of people use this very clinical and sterile term from a really misguided place, and maybe even narcissistic themselves in some way or the other. Like, again, to hurt people or to demonize. That doesn't mean there aren't narcissists. Of course there are, but as you said, it's a true narcissist it's a really low number of people. And again, this does not dismiss anybody's experience with toxic people. But like Brenda and I were talking about in the energy vampire episode, the likelihood of someone being in a true to form energy vampire is really low. Most of the time, people are just siphoning off other people's energy because they don't know how to care for their own, or there's some underlying trauma or some underlying cause. And I think that this is probably the case here too. So,
yeah, maladaptive tendencies is the biggest thing I see.
Well, and literally, it's become shorthand for someone who hurt me, right? This person hurts me. Oh, they're a freaking narcissist. Well, maybe they are, but they're probably not. They're probably just toxic, or abusive, or some other likely cause. So, because this is not simple. As you said, and we're going to get into this, it's on a spectrum. There are healthy levels to these things that we talk about. It is a balance, right? But it's not a simple thing. You don't just throw someone in a box. It's a spectrum, and its scale stretches from healthy self-regard, which is the kind that we all need. We all need that, to that pathological extreme where people are exploiting you and manipulating you and harming you. So this isn't just a nice and easy thing. It's a whole thing, right? From one side.
Then that scale slides to one whole other side where you have, like, when we're going to go into this, we got the overt narcissist and there's the covert narcissist, which is the type that manipulate. They always have to be the victim, and they always come across as, I am all altruistic and I do all I can by others, when in the end it's all self-serving, trying to make face. And again, we fall somewhere on this spectrum here. And the more towards the center we get, the healthier it gets, because it goes from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic.
Right. Let's do a quick show of hands here. You and me and all of you. Quick show of hands here are human beings. Yeah, you fall on the spectrum somewhere. You fall on this one extreme, the other. More than likely not. Most of us aren't going to fall on the extremes. We're going to fall somewhere in there. And that's not always set thing. Sometimes we float around, depending on who we're coming in contact with, what's happening around us, all this stuff. So what is our number one goal today for this episode?
So we're going to be diving into types of narcissists, but the big thing is to explain the scale of narcissism, and potentially to identify toxic behaviors that stem from different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, right. Because at the end of the day, and we're going to learn this, and I hope we come away with this, but the bottom line is people act from wounds as often as they do from malice. So it's not always malice. It probably usually isn't malice. There are exceptions to every rule, right? And of course, we can't gauge every single person where they fall, because they don't always fall here all the time. Even clinically diagnosed narcissists can reform.
Yeah.
Right? So
with enough self-awareness, it's rare. It's very rare.
Well, I mean, you have to do
the work. But they can.
You have to do the work. No one is beyond redemption. I will never not believe that. No one is beyond redemption. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of support. And, for the victims, they get hurt enough, the actual narcissists, but even the toxic people, even the abusive people, they need a lot of support too. And I'm not giving a preference of one over the other. Of course, as a knight, I will always protect the weak and vulnerable first. We have to make a decision. We have to choose, right? Because sometimes some people do deserve our attention and our help more than others. But that doesn't mean that we don't approach it in a way where we don't become the thing that we are standing against. And that's always the tricky part. So there's an axiom that ties into this that I wanted to bring to you. Confusion distorts reason. When in doubt, do not act. Seek guidance and proceed cautiously. That one comes up a lot with these shadowy type shows of the mind that we do, and how this axiom sets the stage for us today. When we throw around that word narcissist, when we throw it around carelessly, or lots of other words that I'm not going to get into today, but you guys know what words I'm talking about, because I'm not going to get out of the realm of what we're talking about. I'm not going to get political about any of this crap. But when we start throwing this word around, we distort reason. We actually are bending the truth, because it's not always true. It's more than likely not true. We're just coming from a place of trauma, right? We confuse wounds with malice. We confuse defense with destruction, and we make those judgments without understanding. And yes, this stuff is hard to do. But that's why we talk about it. It's why we talk through it as best we can. This axiom reminds us to pause before acting on assumption. And what does assumption do, Michael?
Creates chaos.
It makes an ass out of you and me, right? So instead of just slapping on a label and shipping them off, we try to seek guidance. This axiom begs us to use discernment and truth. And the good old pause. Good old pause. That breath can mean the difference between actually furthering harm or create healing. So it gives us a chance there. How does respect fit into this? The agreement of respect.
Well, I think it's kind of ties into the sanctity of all life, because it's respecting the humanity behind each individual. Even those who are truly narcissists, they are truly wounded human beings. And most people, when they go through narcissistic abuse and they go through the healing process, because many people do, it is so destructive being with a narcissist that at the end of that side is pity. It is remorse for that person, because in the end, the reason narcissists are so hard to reform is because, unfortunately, whether overt or covert, it's a very effective way they found to get their needs met without having to be vulnerable. And finding new strategies and learning to be vulnerable is their greatest weakness. It is the one thing they can't stand. In fact, when you know a narcissist, if you end up understanding them on a deeper level, they will usually hold you in contempt.
Yeah.
Because you know a part of them they want no one else to see.
Another couple of the ethos that kind of struck me as I was preparing for the show today. One obviously was truth, but the other was connection. Let me ask you this. At the root of this, is there a distorted hunger for connection?
Yes, because instead of connection, they crave control.
Right.
They care more about what people think of them than what people stand for in their lives.
So if this is truly the case and we begin to understand this, we can then shift from demonizing to being more discerning, right?
Yeah.
We can say this behavior is harmful, but we don't have to cut off the truth that whatever's behind that, whatever's underneath that, is actually something universal, something we all do. Just most of us don't take it to the extreme.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when I started getting into the healing scene and learning about narcissism, I was questioning so often, am I a covert narcissist? Because I have many of the tendencies. I didn't know how to advocate for my needs, so I would be passive and I would manipulate to try to get those needs met instead of ask directly. Mm-hmm. You know, there'd be moments where it's like, it's easier for me to tell the story of the victim than to own up to the part I was playing in my own situation, which included just staying in those situations.
Yeah.
And I mean, luckily I've learned enough to realize it's like, no, I have some of these tendencies, but that does not make me a narcissist. The fact I'm questioning it is a great sign that I'm not a narcissist. Yeah. But it's really important to realize that this scale exists in most people's lives.
Yeah, so I was asking you before the show, I never considered the idea, or I suppose the truth, that there is such a thing as healthy narcissism. And I was asking you about it, which is kind of what we're segueing into. But because when I hear the word narcissism, I automatically go to the negative aspects that we're talking about. Someone who's overly arrogant or cruel or manipulative. And almost like it's a flaw of existence. Like, how can anybody exist with narcissism? So let's dive into that spectrum that we're talking about, because I could be wrong, but I don't know if lots of people understand that there is kind of a good aspect to this.
Yeah, so there was a book I read a while back. I've referenced it a few times on the show. It's one I highly recommend for anyone listening to this to read, called The Laws of Human Nature. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to narcissism. And it talks about this scale. And there is the extremes. It's understanding what are the motives behind these different negative personality types that can stem from it. But it's also understanding that this is a part of human life. It is a part of our life. It is a function of the ego almost, rather than a personal flaw. It's rooted in self-perception and validation needs. And, many of us go through life creating these maladaptive coping mechanisms on how to get our needs met. And these are narcissistic traits that sort of fall towards one side or the other. Do I get angry when my needs are not getting met? Do I get passive and manipulative when my needs are not getting met? There are different sides of this, and you can even fluctuate between the two sides. And that's totally normal. It's just making sure that, one, you're not taking it to the extremes, but also not falling into that toxic territory. You know, if you catch yourself being manipulative, stop yourself, take the moment to pause, and be direct. And if you trust the person you're working with, express that, hey, I'm learning how to do this. I realized I was behaving in a manner that was not of the character I want to have, but... You know, healthy narcissists can help give us self-confidence, self-respect, ambition. I mean, but unhealthy narcissism, you know, you get into entitlement, lack of empathy, exploitation. And it's figuring out.
That is their primary pursuit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So a healthy place on this spectrum of narcissism, on the scale of narcissism, would be, you know, healthy self-confidence and self-respect and taking pride in our accomplishments, whether they're big or small, right? And believing in our self-worth.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're all about balance here, aren't we? This is
right. And you know, just going into those modes right there of healthy narcissism with self-confidence, self-respect, and ambition, intrinsic. Yet entitlement, lack of empathy, exploitation, that's extrinsic. And that's really where you can get a gauge on how healthy is your narcissism.
The other word that goes hand in hand with narcissists that I hear people throwing around a lot is gaslighting. What is that?
Oh, gaslighting. So gaslighting, by definition, would be the changing of the perception of reality. So it's like if I were to slap you in the face today and then you confronted me about it tomorrow and I'm like, I never did that. Why are you making that up? And, you know, narcissists are not the only ones to gaslight. I realize that many people do this as a subtle way to avoid accountability.
So, yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction, because more often than not, we are trying to not be accountable to things, right?
Exactly. So many people fall.
I wonder where this obsession with this word, with these two words, came from, right? It's like, did 10 people read a book and then become experts and then tell 100 more and 100 more and 100 more? Because it seems like everybody, and I'm not an expert in this. I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not an expert in this. Right? I don't think I've ever encountered in a relationship a narcissist. I see lots of these traits in people that I have known and people that I've had relationships with, but I never called them a narcissist or never thought they were a narcissist, no matter how much trouble they caused me, right? But yeah. It really, really seems like some kind of bag was opened and all of a sudden everybody is gaslighting and everybody's a narcissist. I wonder where that started. I have no idea.
You know, I have a hunch, and I might catch a lot of flack for this. So I think gaslighting originally, I think a lot of people do gaslight, and a lot of people do it unintentionally. I mean, you worked in law enforcement. When they have people come and see a lineup of all the people who could be potential perpetrators of a crime, I mean, our memories are not the best when emotions are high and things are raised, and often many of the details get misconstrued. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of the gaslighting we hear about from especially a lot of those relationships where people are just throwing the term around is someone misunderstood the data, misunderstood a conversation, and they walked away with their perception of what happened, and the other person walked away with their perception of what happened, and now they're gaslighting each other because they have two separate experiences.
Right. So what is the universal truth about this scale or spectrum of narcissism? Let me ask you in a different way. So what's the bottom line? What's the one thing that we could all take away from in understanding there is a scale or a spectrum here?
We need balance and flexibility. We need to understand that these traits, when they harden, when they calcify, and they start going into, like you were talking about, dealing with people who seemed pretty narcissistic but weren't narcissists. I consider a lot of people to be highly narcissistic. Doesn't mean they're narcissists, but it means that their coping mechanisms are so ingrained in them that they're too afraid to try either new methods of getting their needs met, or they stand firm in their abusive or manipulative behaviors that in turn get them what they want. And you see this with a lot of people. Again, the person who gets angry all the time. There's no better way to have your kids listen to you than to yell at them and get in their face. And do not do that. That is not what I am saying. But these people learned that through that type of behavior.
That's what happened to all of us.
Yeah. And then you have the other side where it's like, if I can just say I'm a victim, I'm going to get the sympathy I need. I'm going to need to get all the validation of why I am hurt in this relationship and they're messed up and not me. And it's that unwillingness. I know I had a bad problem with that. When I was in a bad relationship, when I got out of that, it'd be all this, they did that. And it would never be, what did I do to make that relationship bad? What brought certain things to that light? Yes, they had toxic behaviors, but what toxicity did I bring? And for me, it was not advocating for myself. It was suppressing my needs and getting bitter and resentful. It was not having those hard conversations when they did something that upset me, or at least not addressing it enough to change the behavior, because us as people, we will naturally push on boundaries to see how far we can take things. That is just how we are. That's what kids do. Yeah. And it's not a matter of you set a boundary and it's just respected from there on out. People will continue to push on that.
Yeah. So, like for me, the bottom line in regards to the spectrum or the scale, we all have these traits that we're talking about, and the better balanced they are, the better we but I will give some grace here. I think although this word and the word gaslighting almost seems like they've been weaponized, I think it seems that way because it's just popular right now, right? In 10 or 15 years, we may not even hear that word for another 20 or whatever. But I don't think people are, for the most part, are weaponizing it on purpose. I think it's just something that they feel, something that they relate to because it's popular, because you see it everywhere, and they're just misguided in using it. Because look, the percent of the population that are actual psychiatrists is probably the same percentage that there are narcissists. It's probably not super high, right? So, right. And I'm not saying that all psychiatrists are narcissists. I'm just saying,
percentage-wise,
it's just more likely that we're just not calling it out right. And I think this happens. So, I'm giving grace here. I don't think people are necessarily weaponizing it on purpose. It does hurt when someone says it to you. No one's ever called me that I know of, but I'm not sure how I would feel if someone did. I don't think I'd feel really good about that.
It's a great sign you're not a narcissist.
Well, I don't think I would like to hear that,
No, I don't think they would either, though.
Lots of other cyst words, lots of other words that end with CIST. None of those words feel good. And maybe that CIST at the end of these words that I'm talking about, maybe that's the tip of the spear, right? That's the sharp part. So, I don't know. But I want to always try to give grace and say that I don't think we're all doing this on purpose. I just think we don't know better. And that's okay. There in the show we did about our codes, there's great power in ignorance if we are willing to be curious and learn and turn that knowledge into wisdom. Everything could be teachers here. So, and at the end of the day, we want things fast. We want things now. We want the magic bullet or the magic pill, right?
Yep.
And it's just easy for us to collapse our feelings and collapse our ill feelings towards somebody into a label.
Our brains love to categorize.
Yeah.
If we can give something a category, then we understand it and we can shuffle it on a shelf and do away with having to figure it out. It's a great way to generalize people's behavior. And often what I see is kind of like I was talking about with myself, and this is really what makes this such a sad term and why I wanted to do this episode is I've seen so many people who are labeling their partners narcissists, and what's really going on is they have poor boundaries. Yeah. They have poor advocating skills. And when you can't advocate for your needs, when you can't stand firm in your nose, people will push on that, and they will you give an inch, they take a mile. And again, this is not justifying toxic behavior. There are fine lines here. But again, there's usually two sides to a story. Mm-hmm. And to those who have gone through narcissistic abuse, I do feel for you. And this is not to belittle anyone who has gone through that, because it is excruciating. It is damage to the soul. Like,
it is to our whole being. Let me give you an example and tell me if I'm on the right. right track here. So you have two bosses in a workplace, right? Both would be considered ambitious and confident. So leader one, boss number one, will walk into a meeting already believing that their ideals are important, that they matter, but they also invite others into the conversation. They'll say, here's my vision. What do you see that I don't? Yep. Right? They leave that space open. They create that space for now collaboration. And their bold confidence, and I would say that takes a lot of confidence and a lot of courage to do that, right? Their bold confidence gives the rest of the team confidence and courage. And boss two enters with that same bravado, with that same high level of confidence, but is very, very fragile when it comes to critique. Yep. They dominate the conversation, they dismiss anybody's contributions, and they leave no space for other people to kind of step up and shine. They project a lot of strength, but maybe on the inside that they don't want to be exposed as not being enough or something, right?
Yep.
So would those be two good examples of a person who's on that healthy side of this scale, and someone who's on the...
No, that's a perfect example. Because one intrinsically knows my work is good, I want to build something great, and I need others to do that. And the other is, let me show how good I am, and I need you to validate me through what I'm giving you, which is exactly what you depict there. And we're going to dive right into, like, what are narcissists? You know, you have what you're talking about there, the overt narcissist. I mean, they're loud, they're grandiose, they have such a sense of importance. They're attention-seeking and dominant. And I mean, a lot of people can be wooed by them. One thing narcissists are really good at is being surface level with people and drawing people in.
They're a performer, right? They're just out there. Yeah.
That, and it's not until you either get long-term exposure or you get really close to them do you start seeing that mask fade away. And you see that extreme desire for control. And that's really at the root of all narcissism. It is a way to control people to get their needs met, because they don't know how to rely on others and be vulnerable.
Now, this is like, and don't do this for your own, and you probably already have, most of us have. Don't type in a symptom onto WebMD and expect to not have a great night, right? Because like most illnesses all share tons of different symptoms. We see some symptoms of the performer, this overt narcissist, right? Because it's hard to see sometimes that fragility inside of them until you get to know them more and more and more. But they're loud and they're grandiose, and they're always seeking praise and seeking admiration, right? And another symptom could be thrives on being the center of attention all the time. But as we were talking about earlier, let me ask you this for just real quick. So the narcissist would be the person that's on the extreme of this other side of this scale, right?
The overt narcissist, yes.
Okay. So they will share these different symptoms, we'll say, with that, but that doesn't make them that. So how do we know, without obviously taking them to a doctor and getting, actually clinically, how do we know if they're more likely or not a narcissist, even though, people because I know lots of people that always want to be at the center of attention, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a narcissist. How would we know?
I think one of the key signs you can look for is how do they handle constructive criticism? Do they get defensive and angry? Do they then retaliate with their own type of anger? There's this term called Darvo, and it's not just narcissists use Darvo, mind you, but it is definitely a surefire sign that they're going in that direction. Now, Darvo is deny, anger, reverse, victim, offender. And it's where, say I'm like, hey man, that is a mouthful. That was really hard for me to pull out right there.
It's hard for me to hear it.
So that's like me being like, hey, I didn't appreciate what you said to me the other night. And you would get angry. Are you serious? That really upset you? Reverse. Maybe if you would have acted better in this way, then I wouldn't have done that. And then there's the victim, and now you're the offender. And so they flip the script when you try to present issues, any type of critiques. And, a lot of people who fall in the spectrum can suffer from this. I've dealt with it myself. but it is something that is consistent. They cannot handle criticism. The other aspect, how controlling are they? Look at how much they try to micromanage you, how much they try to micromanage your feelings. And I'm not saying appease to them, but try to shut you down when you have problems, when the story tries to shift to you. Are they self-interested and self-centered? Because that's another key feature. The world revolves around them. Or at least that's the way they want things to be.
That's the illusion, right?
Yeah. And that's what they're trying to keep going.
So the next one is the covert, right?
Yeah, and these...
Reading the show notes, it almost feels like I've met people closer to this than I have the first one. I think for me, this one seems to be more prevalent.
Yeah. Well, and it's all... So, not to be sexist in any way, shape, or form, more often men are the covert narcissists, are the overt narcissists, and females fall into the covert narcissism. And, again, they start off as really altruistic, wanting to help everyone. But it's those who are close to them that you start realizing they're the victim in every story they have in their lives. They manipulate through guilt. Like, that's one of the other surefire signs. You hurt my feelings, now I need you to do this. They try to play on those emotions and manipulate and be... It's all passive tactics.
Yeah, passive aggressiveness.
To the extreme.
I don't like passive aggressiveness at all. I don't. Almost to the point where if I see myself, and I'm passive aggressive sometimes too, of course. When I see myself doing it, I'm like, wait a minute, partner. Hold on there, cowboy. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say. Do what you need to do. If you hurt their feelings, then that's their business. I can't. I don't try to hurt feelings, but sometimes, that part's on them. But passive aggressiveness, you see that a lot. At least I do, and maybe I see it a ton because I'm always on the lookout for it because it's one of my pet peeves. I'd rather just somebody just, slap me in the face than just kind of beat around the bush, and I don't have time for that.
Yeah. Well, and covert narcissism, in my opinion, is probably the most corrosive type of narcissism to have when you're dealing with it in relationship, because often we have a tendency to project our own values on other people, and covert narcissists slide under the radar super well because you see that altruism, you see that feigned compassion, you see the poor me story, and you're like, my heart really goes out for you, and it's very easy to fall into that trap. And one of the other key signs to see covert narcissism is there's like a switching off that happens. All of a sudden they withhold emotions, withhold information. They start withholding time with you. And I mean, again, there are people who are... Right? Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there are dismissive avoidance, which is a type of attachment, which have narcissistic traits. Covert narcissistic traits does not make them narcissists, but it's all about what's the motive behind it. Do they do it to have that sense of control, or do they do it because they don't know how to be vulnerable? And it can be really difficult to discern that, but ask yourself, how often are you questioning your own reality? Which ties into not only gaslighting, but there's this thing that happens in these type of toxic dynamics called cognitive dissonance. And it's where what we know and what we feel are two very contradictory forms of thought. And we end up battling between what we know and what we feel. And it creates this distortion, this obsession, and it can be chaotic. It can rain hell on our lives. Because we're seeing the good in them, we see the altruism, but we realize we're being lied to, we see the manipulation, and we can't rationalize because we can't make these two parts of this person into one because they don't fit together.
So what does this do to the person who is kind of leaning towards being a narcissist? For the person on the wrong end of this, on these relationships, what happens inside? I mean, do we start to see are they actually corroding? Or what happens to their being? I know they're creating drama and issues for the other person. What's happening on the inside? They're causing damage here, but how much damage are they causing on the inside for themselves?
Oh, it's self-destructive. I mean, people start to question their own reality. so much self-doubt starts to surface. As that happens, confidence goes down, self-esteem goes down, and you get to a place where you're constantly wondering if you're enough, if you're doing enough. And it's this vicious cycle, because as you're trying to decide, is this someone who is truly altruistic and I'm not holding up to their expectations, or is this someone manipulating me and taking advantage of me? That's why people stay in relationships so long. Aside from a thing called trauma bonding, which is very common in these relationships. It's the hot and cold. That intermittent reinforcement creates an addiction. Mm-hmm. And it's this slow degrading of self-worth, trying to get that praise they got in the beginning.
What about for the manipulator? The one who is, covert, or the performer, or the perpetual victim? What's happening on the inside of them? I know, I get what they're doing to the victims of this, but what's happening? What kind of destruction are they doing to themselves, the manipulators?
Realistically, the destruction they're doing is just validating their own ways they go about getting their needs met. They honestly, more often than not, when it comes to actual narcissism, they're getting off to it. Again, their main drive is control. And watching their partner go into this confusion instead of blaming them makes them feel powerful. It makes them feel entitled. And so on a soul level, there's probably an inner knowing that's being squished down, because in the end, all narcissists truly feel alone because no one knows who they are. There is no vulnerability. There is no letting anyone in. And so it's a very lonely life. It's a very sad life. I mean, but it's often already that damage was done in childhood. That's usually when narcissism begins.
So you introduced me to a third one that I thought was really interesting. This dismissive, this kind of stoic genius. What's that all about?
So they're not as big into love bombing, which is a big part of the narcissistic phases. It starts off where they come across as the perfect person. Even with the overts, they buy you gifts, they take you on dates, they make you out to be the best thing that's ever happened to them, until they start turning the other cheek, which is when that trauma bond begins, because it starts with that extreme hot to extreme cold, and you're constantly chasing that addiction. Well, the dismissive isn't as big into love bombing, but they get you in the same way. They open up. No one's ever had me open up like this before. You really have done something special here. Like, you're amazing. And then slowly that emotional unavailability starts happening. They start becoming disinterested. And there's this inner knowing. Like, our nervous systems can tell when someone is not invested in a relationship. And often we tune it out to our own detriment. It's that gut feeling we have that this is not right. And it's superiority through attachment and indifference. I think I heard a story where it's like, you're there for this person nonstop and you break your leg and you need them to take you to the hospital. Like, oh, I'm busy right now. Get an Uber. And it's just this complete detachment from your own well-being, as well as the withholding, like from the dismissive, the covert. But the covert does it as a way to manipulate and get what they want. The dismissive does it because they just are disinterested.
I see this trait. We've talked about, I think probably early on in this podcast, not in this episode, but early on when we first started doing the podcast, we talked about those teachers and those mentors and those masters that aren't good for you, right? And this really fits the bill with some of those, because really they make themselves appear that they're above all of it. And they would even say they're above this, narcissism. They would say, I'm above all that. Here you are. Here I am. I'm your teacher. Here I am, right? These are the kind of people that early on, even when I was working with you at the beginning, I was telling you, I always encouraged you to seek other mentors, other teachers, because I'm not worried about what you're going to do, because I don't know everything. These are the things to look out for, and these traits and these things we're talking about in this type of dismissive narcissism, these are literally the things I was telling you to look out for, right? Because these are the things that we see in these kind of teachers, mentors, masters, really culty type ones too, right? It just reminds me of this in that conversation you and I had. Look, go seek, knowledge from this person, but while you're out there moving around and walking around, be on the lookout for these things, because you know, if they're putting themselves up here and gatekeeping and hoarding all this knowledge, number one, they probably don't actually know anything. They're just bullcrapping you. But if they really do feel this way, not a good sign.
Yeah. And one thing I got to point out here is as we go through these different types of narcissism, and maybe covert is more man, there's more men in the overt section and more females in the covert. Like, this is not restricted by gender. This is all about coping mechanisms that have been developed. But yeah, when it comes to leaders, I mean, it's abundant. I mean, you look at politics, it's like you almost have to be a narcissist to get, you have to be high on the narcissist spectrum to be able to handle being in politics.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So,
and, you know,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
When you look at these types of narcissism, at the core, it's the same with all of these. And it's fragile self-worth that is protected by these defense mechanisms. And again, why it's so hard to get them to reform is the fact that they have these survival mechanisms have served them well, and anything that would go against them is almost unbearable. When you're used to manipulating to get what you want, it's very hard to shift into vulnerability and trust. When you're used to controlling others, it's hard to give up that control and trust that other people can handle it, and it's okay to take the lead sometimes.
Yeah.
And again, this is not justifying the behavior.
Well, you know, these three masks, they may all look different. They might have different paint on them, but they're all made from the same thing, right? And they're covering the same wound. This is really a shared root. This stuff roots all the same, and usually around an insecurity about being enough.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't matter if they're loud, quiet, or detached. They all kind of come from the same place. And of course, in Ashla, what we say to this is that every distortion comes from disconnection. This is a symptom of disconnection from creation, from others, from themselves, but it stems from disconnection. And what's interesting about this stuff may seem like an excess of love for the self, like arrogance. They almost always present as arrogance, right? But actually, it's more of like a starvation of it, which is so weird, right? It presents as this: I love myself so much that I am like this, but really, they're starving. They're starving.
Well, they don't know how to validate themselves. That's why they have to do these mechanisms. I like the term starving because I was going to say that they loathe themselves, but it is a starving of self-love. And so they got to control everything outside of themselves in order to feel that love, to feel wanted, to feel needed. And it's also why they're so afraid to be vulnerable, because any vulnerability means they're actually going to be seen. And if they're actually going to be seen, they're going to be rejected, is their mentality, which I think is at the heart of many people who have narcissistic traits. I think vulnerability is something that is in scarce supply. It's getting better. But the reason people are so afraid to be vulnerable, they isolate, and there's not as much connection going on in the world, as everyone is so afraid to be seen for who they truly are.
Right. It's almost a confusion of what love actually is. That's kind of how it hits me. It's like these negative tendencies almost seem like they don't know what love is.
Yeah. Or at least self-love.
Yeah. I mean, a confusion. Like, I love myself unconditionally. Of course, I know I make mistakes. I'm in my skin all the time, right? But I still love myself anyway. I don't have conditions upon my self-love. But it almost seems like there's something confusing them of that. You know, like, for example, as a kid, if you learn that you're only really valuable if you perform, or if you please, or if you whatever, you kind of learn to use that instead of actually learning true love.
Yeah.
Because that's not love, right?
When it's like, if we look at the origins of narcissism, I mean, in childhood, often the overt narcissist comes from overpraise. Their parents always telling them they're the best, they're good at everything they do, getting them whatever they want. They teach those children, I get whatever I want, I'm what matters. But they never learn to validate themselves because they always got it from their parents. Yeah. You know, one of the most effective parenting videos I've seen, and this is something I'm really taking to heart as I'm going into having kids, is it's like when your kids draw a picture or something and they ask you, what do you think? It's not instantly say, oh, I love it. It's, what did you think about it? Have them validate their own work. You know, and then when we get to the other side, the the covert narcissist, it's about neglect. It's the kid never got their needs met. So how did they learn to get their needs met? By manipulating, by blaming, by trying to turn one person on another. And that way they could get that attention.
Yeah. These are defense mechanisms against insecurity at the end of the day. I used to think these people were arrogant, which is another pet peeve, but I'm sure I'm arrogant sometimes, or at least I come across that way to someone, somewhere.
Well, they are arrogant to a degree because it's any type of feedback, anything that goes against. If they have a strong opinion and you were to challenge it, you're instantly the villain because you're attacking now their sense of self. So there is a high level of arrogance, but it's more of a protection mechanism than a superiority. There's a superiority complex.
Yeah, there has to be. Yeah, there has to be. There has to be. So think of a child who grew up hearing, we're proud of you because you got straight A's, or because you hit a home run, or because you got a trophy, and then they become an adult who cannot tolerate failure, right? And then another kid grows up seemingly invisible, and they're only noticed when they're sick, or when they're in pain, or when they're faking those two things. They become an adult who manipulates through kind of, my sickness is greater than yours type thing. And then would you say the other kid is someone who grew up in a ton of chaos, where vulnerability was not a very safe state of being to be in?
Yeah. I look at it. So there's this thing called the attachment styles. And I look at narcissism as attachment styles gone to the extreme. And it's, biology has a part to play with it. Children, when it comes down to it, it's never about what happens to us. It's how we internalize how to show up in the world. And it's like, you could have the anxious person who becomes the overt, who becomes domineering and controlling. You could have the dismissive, you could have the avoidant that becomes the covert narcissist, and the dismissive avoidant who becomes the dismissive narcissist. There are the extremes of these attachment styles, and unfortunately, if something sticks in childhood, you start building a system around these mechanisms that get your needs met.
So, look, I'm learning just as much as anybody today from you. I don't have a lot of formal education on this topic. So I just before you move us along again, I just want to kind of bring us back real quick for my sake. What are these key differences between healthy narcissism and this kind of the negative stuff we've spent, that most of us kind of spend our time thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, sort of how I talked about intrinsic needs next is extrinsic needs. So it's like healthy narcissism is a sense of pride, self-advocacy, and a belief in one's worth, which is key to having a healthy and assertive life. But when does it go from self-love to self-absorption? I think really starts to be where you start bridging into the unhealthy territory with it. Yeah. Healthy narcissism fuels creativity, leadership, resilience. But a lot of the times that means flexibility. It means the ability to work with others and help them ascend their potential as you are doing your own, instead of trying to control, dominate, and put on a face that gets you validation and makes you the hot shot at work.
Right.
But so I think
you can be the hot shot at work by being good, by staying in this healthy range, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, it's like, I've worked in both workplaces where you have the person who's over your shoulder, micromanaging the work you're doing, trying to take people's ideas, trying to just control everything. And then you have the boss who lets you sort of like, this is what your responsibilities are. They hold you to that standard, but they also give you the creativity to do your job to the best of your ability, whatever that looks like. And it's night and day.
This reminds me of the axiom, nourish the mind, body, and spirit with the substance of virtue and righteousness. Now, that sounds like a really lofty, poetic thing to say when we're talking about this spectrum or scale of narcissism, right? But this idea of healthy narcissism reminds me of this axiom because it is a form of nourishment.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of that starvation or even excess. Because without self-worth, we spiritually starve. We have problems.
Yeah.
With an inflated self-image, we overindulge on illusion.
Yeah.
Right?
Very
on
much
lies,
so.
On falsehoods. So this axiom really tells us that balance and virtue are that substance our spirit truly craves, what we really need. And that healthy self-regard, that healthy ego, we talk about on our path, we don't seek to destroy the ego as many other ancient paths, modern paths, whatever, really, they'll say attack the ego, destroy it, kill the ego. We don't do that. You need it. You need it, right? So, but what you really need instead of destruction is that balancing, that bringing things into harmony. So this healthy self-regard, this healthy narcissism, as you call it, and I don't know if just you call it, I'm sure this is an actual term somewhere. I'm showing my ignorance here today, but this to me seems like that righteous middle, that place where you're in pretty good balance. When you can come into the room with that, strong confidence and strong self-worth, but also open that space up for people to shine and to have, input into something you're doing. Again, goes back to the good boss, bad boss thing that I was talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, on both sides.
Because if we're in this middle, right, it keeps us from collapsing into things like shame or overinflating into entitlement.
When it's like shame's at the heart of narcissism. You talk about that self-wound, that starvation, and that inability to love yourself fully. It's because of all the shame you feel for who you are. And sadly, as we were talking about earlier about sort of what damage gets done as this happens, cognitively the narcissist may not know or care about how much damage they're doing to someone else, but their soul will feel that hit. That shame will grow inside of them. That shame for who they are, the shame for how they get their needs met. And I think a lot of us with narcissistic tendencies, which most of us have to some degree, it all is based on shame, whether it's not being able to advocate for your needs or needing to get angry when something does not go our way.
Yeah.
I think, the key is looking for what the real red flags are of narcissism compared to, normal human ego moments. Because often we just have a fractured ego, an ego that has poor coping mechanisms that isn't healed. Yeah. And so we only know how to get our needs met through these other ways. Right.
So as I said earlier, it's really easy in our culture today to call everyone who hurts us a narcissist. So how do we know? How do we know? I know that I asked this question a little bit earlier, but I'll ask it to you again because what I really want you to tell me, and tell all of us, what are some of those key red flags that kind of tell us, wow, this person should get checked up on? They are flirting dangerously with actually being a narcissist.
I think really when it comes down to it, distinguishing between the traits versus the disorder. So, I mean, what is the consistency of this toxic behavior? Is there any accountability? Because, often, I know for me, like I said, I realized I was slightly manipulative in relationships when getting my needs met because I wouldn't advocate for myself.
Right.
But once I became aware of that, there might have been, it wasn't something that went away instantly. It was moments where I'd catch myself doing it and be like, hey, I'm not being sincere right now. This is really what I need from you, and I'm beating around the bush right now. And so it's what, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask a follow-up to this. How does a victim of a narcissist finally get to the point where they can see this consistency of behavior? Because I imagine it's not easy to see at first.
No, often most narcissistic survivors don't know it at first. They'll have people who will tell them, like, this is a bad relationship, this is abusive, and they'll brush it off. Often they'll even hide what's going on in the relationship because they don't want to hear any of the negativity. And usually it's when they get to that rock bottom do they question, like, am I really the problem? It's really difficult, and sadly, people will stay in a narcissistic relationship their whole lives because their whole sense of self-worth then becomes catered to the narcissist's point of view. Because that whole trauma bond, it's all about, if I can just go back to where we were in the beginning, then everything will be okay. And they're chasing this illusion. They talk about slot machines. Why they're so addictive is you're constantly pulling on the lever and you never know when it's going to pay out. The same goes for narcissism, and it is highly...
And all around you hear the bells and whistles. Somebody's hitting, so that somebody could be me.
Yeah. They akin this to a heroin addiction with the physiology you feel in your body. The constant high anxiety and then the bliss you feel when you finally get that
feels good.
little breadcrumb of attention or of love and affection. And it's just this constant chasing until finally they're like, I've had enough of this. Yeah. And so that's why so many people who have survived narcissistic relationships go on the healing journey, is they get to that point where it's like, why am I doing this?
Yeah. The most traumatized become the best healers more often than not. They do. They do. Some of the best and most powerful healers I've ever met in my short time on this earth have been people that really, really, really went through it. We've talked to a few on this show, and their stories are incredible.
Yeah.
So we talked about lack of accountability earlier. I imagine that's something that, where someone's always blaming someone else, or they gaslight them to make them believe that it's their fault, even when it's not.
Yeah, it's really consistent. It's a lack of empathy, really. It's often, you'll notice that when they are being apologetic or they're trying to make amends, it's never through the lens of, do the means justify the action? It's always is an ends to a means. They're doing it because they want to get it dealt with and over with. It's not genuine or sincere apologies. It is always just another form of trying to lead you on. And it can be rough.
I have a really easy test for empathy.
Scratch.
So you talked about empathy. There is a test, a pretty easy test that I use on people, not because I think they're narcissists, but this really tells me if this is a kind of person that can sit in my circle of trust, right? Can they listen to another person's experience without somehow turning the focus back on them? And if that answer is consistently no, it's a sign of something, some sort of distortion, probably in their ego or in how they're projecting out, right? And I'm not going to say they're narcissists, but completely off the air, you told me about some things in your upbringing, your childhood, that I was like, holy smokes, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't try to, and no, I'm not trying to convince you that I'm not a narcissist, but this is just an example I have. I was like, what did I say? I said, damn, I thought my childhood was bad, right? Like I didn't, like I wasn't going to even, no, man, no. And it's the same thing with Heather, early on in our relationship. Of course, as you get to know somebody, you start talking about deeper things and, your roots and where you come from and stuff. And I was like, wow, I really thought that I had it bad. I didn't have it bad, dude. I did not have it bad comparative. So this little test, can they listen to someone else's experience without trying to play the comparison game? Or, they're always trying to one-up you on something. You killed a moose. Well, I killed a Tyrannosaurus Rex, Right. So
when you bring up such a good point here, because narcissists do have a very big tendency of, they love to talk about themselves. And when you talk about yourself, there's a genuine disinterest, whether they forget what you said. Mind you, the love bombing phase, they might retain some of those things, but it's a constant need to talk about themselves, their accomplishments, what they've been through. And the conversation always comes back to them.
Yeah. I don't know if that's exactly an empathy test. I mean, definitely when you share someone shares their feelings, and then you're either dismissive or, oh, that's not so bad. That's not so bad, but you can kind of get a feel for how empathetic somebody actually is pretty quick, especially if you're meeting them for the first time. Now, if you're trying this empathy test 10 years into the relationship and you suspect there's some problems here, you might want to get some outside perspective for that. And that's where your circle of trust is really important too, building your tribe, because they will call it out for you. You just have to listen, which I understand can be hard.
I think,
because Michael, we all have these moments of defensiveness and selfishness or whatever. I do.
Yeah.
You. And these are very human things. That's how you know you're a human, if you have these imperfect things. But it's how fast do you snap back into a more balanced actions, right?
Yeah.
Toward connection and toward accountability and toward empathy.
And I think it's just important to distinguish. It's like we all have these traits to some degree, and we can learn to find that balance. Mm-hmm. But I think, again, there's two key points within this conversation we're having, which is, one, to be able to identify what the traits are, and to not label everyone as a narcissist, but understand many people are wounded and don't have proper coping mechanisms. You know, it's easy to fall into a labeling scheme because it helps categorize and, again, put someone on a shelf. That way you don't have to worry about it anymore. But most people have their humanity where they just don't know how to go about doing things differently. And if we can work together to be accountable, to express our needs, to help people dive into themselves without judgment or criticism, I mean, we can help so many of these so-called narcissists find healing and growth too and become functional members in a relationship. But it usually involves both parties to do that work.
Right. Or you know, start at their core. They have a lot of shadow work to do. Yeah. The real danger here does not lie in the label. The word means nothing without context, right? What I want to remind people of is the impact of these behaviors. And it doesn't matter if they're on the mild side or the severe side. They corrode. They corrode your dignity, and they destroy connection between people, or they destroy connection within themselves. And whether someone is actually clinically narcissistic or just wounded and acting out, which is, as you said, probably more likely the case, toxic and abusive behavior must never be tolerated. Ever. This goes back to what we're saying about forgiveness. You know, we're not forgiving what somebody did. We're not forgetting. Same kind of thing applies here. Just, it doesn't matter why or where on that spectrum they fall. You should never tolerate toxic and abusive behavior towards you. So, and the sooner you can find awareness in that, in a relationship, you know, don't ignore it. I often hear people say, well, it'll get better. I can fix him. I can change him. It can get better. Not all of us were meant to heal the other. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we're not the right person. So,
and you can't heal someone who doesn't want to be healed.
That's right. So, to kind of understand these boundaries, we can't tolerate abuse. We can't tolerate this toxic stuff. Sometimes the best thing you can do is remove yourself from that. So I just wanted to say that because, you know, it sounds like we're kind of like, well, you know, they're not that bad. Look, if they're bad, they're bad. Yeah. And you got to protect yourself.
And sometimes there might be just a compatibility issue. Maybe someone is headstrong, bulldozy, and you don't have the boundaries to stand up to that. You need to learn when to leave a relationship, because often we stay in dynamics expecting the other person to change, and we just build resentment when we just need to create that distance and remove ourselves from those dynamics. Chemistry does not always equal compatibility. Do you have any final thoughts you want to add before we wrap it up?
I do. So we've said a lot, at least I've said a lot, where this word kind of gets thrown around, and sometimes it may feel like it's being weaponized. I don't think that's the case, you know, consciously. I think people use it because they think that's what it means. And, you know, no harm, no foul there. But the truth is more nuanced around this topic, is what I'm learning. But there's also a more compassionate component to this. Because as I learned that narcissism exists on this spectrum, or on this sliding scale, right? At one end is a really healthy dose of self-respect, saying, you know, where a person believes they're worthy and they carry that confidence wherever they go. But on the other end, it becomes very destructive. It's almost like the shadow demanding constant validation, especially at the expense of others. But the wisdom of Ashla calls us to see both sides as clearly as possible, because we always seek to be in harmony. So we have to try and see the whole scale, the whole spectrum, as it is, the truth. So, and to recognize when someone's behavior harms dignity or is abusive or toxic, it must be named, it must be called out. But also, at the same time, to remember that every shadow likely hides a wound. So this is where our ethos guides us. Love reminds us that even the wounded deserve compassion after you've protected the weak.
That includes yourself.
Especially yourself. Especially yourself. Truth calls us to name harm without becoming that, but it calls us to call it out, shine a light on it. Integrity calls for us to be whole, to align with our inner and outer, and to erect those boundaries both inside and out. So connection puts us in line with empathy, because that's where healing begins. That's the first step here, is have empathy for yourself and for others. And the sanctity of life reminds us that no soul is disposable, especially our own. So the call to action is this. Reflect on where you stand on this scale. Do you carry healthy pride that honors you and honors your light? Or do you have fear and shame, wounds that distort this into different masks or different costumes? And when you encounter others day to day, whether in a healthy way or a hurting way or a harmful way, become aware of these, discern these, choose wisely, because compassion does not mean tolerating abuse. And we're going to do a show just on compassion, because I think it's one of those things where people don't quite understand exactly what compassion is. It's become kind of a lofty buzzword too, but I digress. But compassion does not mean tolerating abuse.
Yes.
And boundaries do not mean abandoning love and connection. They strengthen those things. So we were talking. We did a show about monsters the other day and shadows. The monsters and shadows we fear most are not always in the other person. Just because we are a mirror in a lot of ways, it's not always the case. Sometimes the other person's wearing a mask, and sometimes we're wearing the mask and we see the mask in others, right? So sometimes it is. But by choosing awareness and courage and seeking the truth, we start to reclaim this balance. We can have pride without arrogance. We can love without distortion, right? When we can be bold and strong without harming another. So that's what I want to leave everybody with today.
Beautiful. So today, with it being sort of all over the place as far as understanding if we're a narcissist, if other people are narcissists, and understanding this topic, I don't have any affirmations or an affirmative prayer today, but I do have an exercise to help us understand and get help us get a better understanding to tell if you or someone you know is showing narcissistic traits. So I call this the 3 windows test. Now, it's to see narcissism through 3 clear lenses: behavior, empathy, and accountability. Without judgment or labels, this isn't about diagnosing someone. It's about noticing patterns.
Please don't do that, because we're not diagnosing anybody.
No. And I'm no expert in this either. I've just read a lot about it. It's a topic that I have found quite interesting. So it's about noticing patterns that protect the ego at the cost of connection. So the first window, the window of behavior. What they do when no one's watching. Ask yourself, how do they treat people? How do they treat people who can't give them anything in return? Do their values match their actions when attention isn't on them? Are their acts of kindness consistent or performative and short-lived? The red flag, narcissistic tendencies show up when admiration is gone. The green flag, healthy individuals act with integrity even when unseen. Next, the window of empathy. Can they feel without centering themselves? Ask, when you express pain, do they offer understanding or shift the focus on themselves? Can they acknowledge another person's reality without correcting, competing, or comparing? Do they express empathy even when it does not benefit them? The red flag, empathy that disappears under pressure or becomes self-focused. The green flag, the ability to stay connected even when uncomfortable. Lastly, the window of accountability. How they handle being wrong.
This is a big one.
When they hurt someone, do they reflect, deflect, or retaliate? Can they apologize without excuses or guilt tripping? Do they grow from feedback, or does it threaten their sense of control? Red flag, they rewrite history to avoid shame. Or, the green flag, they face their shadow without making it yours. For our journaling prompt today, ask yourself, do they seek understanding or power, connection or control? And when I look at myself, which do I see when I feel unseen? If this episode helped you understand narcissism a little better, or you think it could help someone else who's struggling with this indecision themselves, please share this episode, like, comment if you have any questions or any critiques, and please subscribe to the channel. We appreciate you guys so much. With love and gratitude, Ad Lucem.
Ad Lucem.